start recording and start live streaming to Facebook. Give me 1 second, please. So I believe we should be live streaming. So I'll welcome you guys all again to this month's Ask the Arb event. My name is Michelle. I'm one of the naturalist interns here at the Arboretum, and I'm joined with Kitty, who is another naturalist intern, and Sean Fox, who is the manager of horticulture and curator of collections and conservation here at the Arboretum. And we are here all to answer any nature-related questions you all may have, any plant, animal, anything in between questions. You're more than welcome to pop them in the chat if you're on Zoom. If you're on Facebook, you can pop any questions into the comments and we will answer them for you. So without further ado, if anyone has a question they want to go ahead and ask, go ahead. So maybe
yes,
to get...
Hello.
Go ahead, Judith.
Thank you. I just had a question around the beaver pond, and I wondered what the status of that was. Other years I've watched beavers going back and forth and building their dams and so on. And I just wondered what was happening in that area.
Yeah, great question, Judith. So over the past winter and the year before that, we had a lot of beaver activity. Some of you walking through the area may have noticed a lot of the beaver chewings and a lot of felled trees. And we've actually put some signs up as well, just so everybody's aware of the trees in that area. But since the past winter, we haven't seen too much activity from the beavers in the beaver pond. So we're thinking they may have just moved on from that area. So we haven't seen them around lately, but hopefully they'll come back and we'll keep an eye out for them. So for right now, they may be taking a little bit of a break from our beaver pond. They may be hanging out somewhere else. We haven't seen too much of them around lately.
It's Judith again. I wonder if I could just ask a follow-up. There also didn't seem to be much water in that pond at all. Is that something that fluctuates as well, the level of water?
Yep, in the ponds in both our Wild Goose Woods and our Victoria Woods, we do notice the waters tend to drop in the fall and it fills up again in the springtime when the snow thaws. So that does fluctuate a little bit throughout the year.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I see a question here in the chat. There is a large new item, looks like a tree trunk, maybe petrified wood, that has been installed in last year's, what is it? It's near the monkey puzzle tree. So yeah. Is anyone familiar with that?
Yeah. So it actually is indeed petrified wood, and this is in our World of Trees collection, right around the central part of the collection, around what we call the Flying Fish Bridge. And what's interesting about that area of the World of Trees, it has a lot of plants that are a little bit more primitive than some of the other plants we see broadly around the Arboretum. So what we've been working on is an exhibit to display and highlight some of those really interesting prehistoric plants, some of their primitive features. So you may notice that there's ginkgo trees nearby, which are very, very, very old primitive plants, dawn redwoods. And then we have some early flowering plants. So some of the first true flowering plants to exist, such as magnolias and Dutchman's pipes. So they've been on the earth essentially a lot longer than things like maple trees and oak trees have. And to kind of further emphasize this, you may have noticed things like the little monkey puzzle tree that we put out every summer, which is not quite cold hardy in Guelph. It's a little bit too cold for it here, so we bring it in the winter just so we don't lose it. But we also have a cycads and tree ferns and things like that, just to show some of these other old plants that have been around since before the dinosaurs, actually. And the rock that you see is actually petrified wood. So it's basically a fallen tree trunk that likely fell underwater where it was oxygen starved and preserved, and then sediment settled on it over many millions of years, compressed the wood, and then it became a petrified rock essentially. So if any of you are visiting the Arboretum who haven't seen this, if you look really closely, you can actually see what look like rings, tree rings in the actual rock or the petrified wood. So it's a really interesting fossil. And we believe that it's actually a fossil from an Araucaria tree, which is the same genus as the monkey puzzle nearby. So we still have a little bit of paleobotanical forensic work to do to confirm what species that may be, but having it close to the monkey puzzle was by design as well.
Awesome. And I see more questions coming in the chat. This one from Tim. Hello, I have a very old apple tree on my property. I believe it is a Pippin variety. Do you have the ability to properly identify the variety?
Hi, Tim. Yeah, we may have the ability, but I guess what I will say is the Arboretum itself, we focus a little bit more on wild species than we do on fruit crop species. And that all being said, there are some incredibly passionate, knowledgeable people who have done the depths of diving into these different fruit crops, especially some of these heritage varieties. So I guess first thing I would say, there are a couple nurseries operating in Ontario who do offer some of the Pippin varieties who would have knowledge of those. Silver Creek Nursery is one, and another one is called Whiffletree Farm and Nursery. And then at University of Guelph in particular, our fruit crop experts are mostly centered at the Simcoe Research Station and the Vineland Research Station. So here at the Arboretum, we have lots of cultivars, some ornamental trees, but a lot of focus on wild species and that biodiversity. Whereas at Vineland Research and Innovation Center, they have experts who have been working on these fruit crops for years. So I would suggest getting in touch with them. So again, that's the Vineland Research and Innovation Center. And I don't know what services they specifically can provide for identification, but that would be your best bet because they have that kind of back knowledge going back over 100 years there.
Awesome. And it seems like, Sean, you're very popular today. We have more plant questions. So from Jeff, I have a question about a large mature butter tree in his yard that seems quite healthy. Are you doing anything to preserve these trees? There are some saplings in the vicinity of the tree.
Okay, yeah, so I guess first of all, yes, we are doing some things to preserve these trees. We have a number of butternuts in the Arboretum. In particular, we have a small archive that we've created back in our nursery compound. I guess to further elaborate on that, there is an organization called the Forest Gene Conservation Association, and they have a Butternut Recovery program that's actually been modeled after our elm recovery project here at the University of Guelph. So they are looking for large, healthy, surviving pure butternut trees and trying to propagate those and build seed orchards. And we're hoping that we in the future may be able to be a location for one of their future seed orchards as well. But right now, your best bet would be to reach out to the Forest Gene Conservation Association, and their website is fgca.net. One thing to keep in mind when you have a big, healthy, beautiful butternut, or what you think is a big, healthy, beautiful butternut, there's often a good chance that it is a hybrid tree. So butternuts are very similar looking to Japanese walnuts and a variety of Japanese walnut called heartnuts. And for years, we didn't realize that they were actually hybridizing with each other. So a lot of young trees and now really old trees that have been popping up all over the province are actually hybrids. And hybrids can be quite difficult to tell apart. One thing I usually say first and foremost, if it looks really, really healthy and happy, there's a better chance it might have some hybrid Japanese walnut in it. Other features to look for are everything on a hybrid is just bigger than a pure butternut. So the twigs are a little bit thicker, the leaves are longer, the flowers are a little bit longer, and the fruit, the husks tend to be a little bit less egg-shaped. It's subtle, but those are things to look for. And ultimately, when the FDCA decides to add those trees to their program, they have to do genetic analysis. So they have to test them for DNA just to make sure that they're working with pure butternuts. So what I would say, certainly if you do have a healthy one, reach out to them, because if it turns out to be a pure one, they would definitely be very interested in working with that tree.
And where did the Arboretum acquire the petrified wood?
We actually acquired it from a local stone yard that had a few extras that they said it would be probably the last ones they would ever have. And we were actually, we were obtaining some stones actually for another project, and we felt that was really interesting interpretive exhibit. It actually kind of doubles up as good seating as a bench as well, in the location that we put it beside the trail. So I do not know if it's something that is available, generally speaking, but we were fortunate to have one nearby that we were able to get.
And more plant questions for you, Sean. So Francesca is asking a few garden questions. To start off with, she has 3 roses of Sharon, and there are buds with small brown dots. She pruned them, but she says, considering I am 80, should I save the bushes? Would you suggest me substitute them with an Ontario white pine now in a container? Is the contaminated soil all right for the pine?
Yeah, typically, you make a good point. When you ever have a plant that might have been diseased, especially something that could be carried in the soil, it's always risky to put the same plant back in. And it's actually kind of things we even know from agriculture, right? Why we rotate crops, and we, don't put soybeans in the same spot corn was the year before, so you don't have soil pathogens build up. And white pines and Rose of Sharon's are quite distantly related. So typically speaking, they don't share a lot of those same pathogens. And I love Eastern white pine. I think that's an absolutely beautiful choice that you really can't go wrong with. This time of year is actually a good time to plant. Just make sure that once you get it in, it's well watered. Mother Nature might do that for you, but if we do have a couple dry weeks, if it has a chance to have good moist soil before the winter sets, it'll actually put on root growth right in through the end of November into December when the ground freezes. And that helps it get anchored in the winter to prevent frost heaving. But also in the winter when the ground freezes, it's harder for plants to pull moisture from that soil. So it's always good to give them a good start before the autumn. But because the weather is so cool, it is a really nice time to transplant plants as well. It's a little bit less stressful on them. So that'll be a big, beautiful tree someday. It's a very good choice.
Thank you.
Another garden question is, there were plenty of insects in the spring on her burning bush. They pruned it, no new leaves, and leaves are now starting to turn downwards. Should she eliminate it?
It's tricky for me to answer that question for certain, as far as what insects you may have had, and then whether the leaves turning downward is something unrelated. The leaves turning downward, if it's really drastic and they dry up and kind of go crisp, it could be something like verticillium wilt, which is a fungus that does impact lots of different species of plants. But it also could just be a general stress, and the leaves might be dropping a little bit sooner this year. But if everything goes well and we have a good spring, it'll emerge fairly normally next year. So I would say, without seeing more symptoms, I wouldn't want to ask you to cut down your plant right away. So maybe keep an eye on it in spring, and if it looks like it's still having problems, you can make another decision then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And one last question from Francesca. 1 year ago, they transplanted from a container a cedar bush and noticed a big curved wooden root. This year, it seems the cedar is struggling. Should they pull it out of the soil, cut the big root, and put it back in the soil?
Yeah, so what you have there is a circling root that can eventually become a girdling root. And a girdling root, what happens is when a root is growing in a container and it keeps circling around, it'll tend to keep doing that once you put it in the ground. And usually you don't see the damage until many years later. When it gets to the point the root keeps expanding in diameter every year and the trunk keeps expanding, and then it'll actually sort of strangle itself a little bit. It'll prevent a certain part of the tree from being able to access water and move it up and down. So those kind of things are always good to correct if you notice them upon planting. As far as whether that's what's causing the stress right now, again, usually it's something that becomes a problem a little further down the road. However, what I would say right now is it might be best to leave that until early spring to fix that. I would suggest fixing it. But if you do it right now, it'll be a little bit more of an added stress on the plant, but probably early April, assuming the ground is thawed, but it's not soaking wet, you can pull that plant out because it'll still be quite dormant at that time of the year, and fix that root and put it back in, and then it'll have the whole growing season to repair itself over the year.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And maybe we give Sharon a bit of a break with all of these plant questions. And we did get a bird question sent in to us. So let me share my screen so we can all see the picture of this mystery bird that was sent in to us. And maybe Kitty can tell us a little bit more about what it is. So I hope everyone here can see my screen. And Kitty, if you want to take it away on what this bird could be.
Yep. So this picture was sent into our email. And from the shape of the bird, it looks more like a sparrow shape. And from the general appearance of the bird, we're thinking that it may be a dark-eyed junco. Now, this was a picture that was taken a little bit further up north, and dark-eyed juncos may be in the area by now. They are typically a bird we'll see here in southern Ontario in the wintertime because they are migratory. So a lot of people, when they think of migratory birds, they think of birds going down south, maybe even as far down south as South America, like bobbing hawks and herons and things like that. They'll go much further down south where it's a lot warmer. But there are birds that are from north of us that will come down to southern Ontario for the winter. And even though it may seem very cold here in the winter sometimes, it is warmer than further up north. So we do get some migratory birds coming down here in the wintertime, and the dark-eyed junco is a great example. One, we only see them here in southern Ontario in the wintertime usually, but they may be moving through downwards now. So this may be a dark-eyed junco is our best guess. It definitely looks like there is some color aberrations with it, because typically the dark-eyed juncos we see in this area are dark gray above with a bright white belly. And this one seems to be very pale all over. So we're thinking that maybe it seems to be a dark-eyed junco with a genetic mutation called leucism. So we're not 100% sure. It could be another genetic mutation, but leucism is something that we see in birds that gives them sometimes patches of white throughout their feathers. And it's similar to albinism. So albino animals can be pale as well, but they do have a different mechanism that gives it the white color. So usually animals that show leucism, they have dark colored eyes, whereas albino animals end up with pale or even red colored eyes. So we're thinking this may be a leucistic dark-eyed junco.
Lovely. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Alrighty. Give me one moment. Sorry for the difficulties. Struggling to stop the share. There we go. And back to you, Sean. We have more plant questions. So someone has a cherry tree on their property, on their mother's property, and they're wondering to get some tips from you on how to graft a peach onto a cherry tree.
All right. Yeah, so a lot of those plants in the Rosaceae family, peaches, cherries, apricots, and plums, they're closely related enough that you can actually perform these intrageneric grafts. And that's sometimes I remember seeing old Reader's Digest in the past where you could buy the one tree that had an apricot and a plum and all these things growing on the same tree. And the concept is that you start with a rootstock, in this case, your cherry tree. And then you, if you get the timing and the material in place at the right time, you can actually graft these other fruits onto it. So the key for you, I'm assuming your cherry tree is not in a pot, it's actually growing outside. So what you would want to do is collect twigs or scions. So the scions would be little twigs with multiple healthy buds, usually mid to late February from your tree, and keep them in a plastic bag with a little bit of moisture. So that can be a moist paper towel, so not soggy, but just moist. Collect them and put them in the fridge. And what that'll do is that will keep those twigs or those scions dormant. You don't want them actively growing. And you want to save that until your cherry tree starts to swell. So the buds start to swell, and that's usually in April. So it's starting to come out of dormancy. It's starting to move, translocate water and nutrients throughout the tree. Those buds start to swell. And that's when you want to take your peach twigs out of your fridge, which are still dormant, and then you can do the grafting onto your cherry tree. So that's probably the first key thing, is even if you know how to graft and you have a knife and you have tape and wax, if you don't get the timing right, it's not going to work for you. So that's really the key with the timing. Beyond that, a little bit difficult for me to fully explain the grafting technique, and you may have already done some research on this, but essentially getting a good grafting knife, so a really sharp knife, you'd be taking off the tips of any branches where you would want to be putting that peach tree in its place, and usually making a cleft graft, which would be essentially slicing downward into the twig, cutting a little wedge out of your cherry and putting it in, sealing it up. Multiple ways of doing that. But if you have kind of looked into some diagrams and photos about how to do that, as long as you get the timing right, that February collection of the twigs, put them in the fridge, and then wait for your cherry tree to come out of dormancy in April, then you should be okay. And yeah, it's actually a really fun thing to do.
And a seed question for you, Sean. This is coming in from Marie, is it Marie's imagination, or are there more seeds hanging from trees this fall than usual? I'm seeing a lot of different trees and shrubs with a lot of seeds on them.
Sure. Marie, it's not your imagination. I would say in general, in any given year, you might have more seeds on some species than others, but this year's a pretty good year. It's not an absolutely incredible year, but a lot of things have a lot of seed on them. And I would say in particular throughout the summer, there's been a lot of species, berry producing species that have been pretty heavy. So we had the red osier dogwoods that ripen up first, followed by the pagoda dogwoods, followed by the silky dogwoods and the gray dogwoods. And there's all this sequence of things that ripen at different times, so that there's always food for different birds to fly in and pick off and move around. So they all have these dispersal strategies. But during that time, there was different species, different elderberries, red and common elderberry, and then things like arrowwood and high bush cranberries and now nanny berries that are producing. And I would say amongst those species, all of them have had really heavy crops this year. So not only are you noticing them being heavy at the time they're ripening up, but a lot of the berries are staying on the tree longer because there's so much choice. So the birds have so much more choice, whereas if only the gray dogwoods had a big crop this year, all the birds would go to the gray dogwoods and all the animals would go to the gray dogwoods and pick them clean in a couple of days. So I think because so many of the berry producing crops are producing seeds and there's more choice and they stay on the plants longer, it does definitely give the impression that there's more seed. Beyond that, a lot of the tree species are really hit and miss this year. There's some that have almost nothing and others that are pretty loaded. And a really good example I'll use as far as a tree that has a really big seed crop this year is ironwood. And ironwood has a dispersal technique that's called masting. And basically what happens with an ironwood, you don't have a seed crop every year. They usually produce nothing. And then every 3 years, every 5 years, they have a huge crop. And what's interesting is that ironwoods all across the region will produce a huge seed crop at the same time. So they're actually communicating through hormones and syncing up and saying, this is going to be the year that we put so many seeds out that there's no way all the rodents can eat all the seeds. So if you put out just 100 seeds every single year, there'd always be enough chipmunks and mice and things to say, oh, this is my meal. I know where it comes from and I'll get them all. But they actually very randomly put out huge masting crops. So they flood the landscape with seeds with the hope that enough of them will actually not get eaten and be able to germinate and reach maturity. So that's what we'll see in some years as well, where something seems like it's really loaded. And in other trees, for example, there is a sugar maple crop this year, but it's not a really heavy crop. Not seeing some crops at all on some of our local oak trees, for example. So we'll likely see heavy crops of both in the coming years.
Awesome. And we're down to our last question I can see here on Zoom. I invite you guys, if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. If you're watching on Facebook, please pop any questions into the comments and we'll get those answered. But next question is, can you recommend a good season or time to pick quinces from a quince bush?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, I guess there's one question I'd have as a follow-up that you might be able to answer for me is whether you have a Japanese quince or a true quince. So do you know?
No.
Okay.
No, it's just a bush, an old bush.
Okay, is it a very small one or is it quite big?
No, it's relatively big, and for sure, I don't know, it could be about 20, 30 years old. It's big.
Okay, very big one. So you might have a true quince, which is a Cydonia, and then there's a lot of smaller quinces that are from Asia. We often call Japanese quinces, and they're actually in the plant family called Chenamales. So different plants, but they both have edible fruits that are
right.
Well, they look like quinces. So yeah, and as far as the timing to collect, really it can vary kind of depending on your reason, but the fruit, when they mature to the point where they're starting to soften up a little bit and they come off the plant fairly easily. So you can give a tug and they'll come kind of with a little bit of effort, but you're not really having to pull them hard off the tree. that's the best time to harvest them. I wish I could say I was an expert with quince. I know my mom makes some delicious quince jelly, and I never learned how to do that from her. But yeah, that's kind of the key timing is when they're starting to kind of soften up a little bit of that color change, and then they're coming off the plant without you having to pull really, really hard. And then usually at that stage, it means they're mature enough that they'll actually after ripen a little bit even off the plant. So it's kind of like a tomato.
Super.
You can pick them a little bit not fully red. They're always nicer to pick when they're fully ripe, but when they start to make that color change and come off relatively easily, it means the fruit is mature and then will after ripen once you're removed from the plant.
Super, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Another question has come in here on Zoom. Someone is curious on what has happened to the koi fish in the Japanese garden pond. They see frogs, but no fish.
Oh, sure. I can try to answer this one. I know Kale, our gardener, has been working in there, but the fish actually, we've never put fish in there ourselves. We've always had fish show up in our Japanese pond. And I can't speak for what's happened to all of them, but I can say that I know I've seen raccoons and great blue herons in that pond, sometimes taking those fish. And obviously that's the natural consequence of releasing fish that aren't, supposed to be in that environment. There is wildlife here that will come get them. I learned that lesson actually as a 13-year-old when I built my first garden outside, and I had some goldfish that I'd had for about 4 years inside, and I built them a little pond out of a kiddie pool, and I dug it into my flower garden, and I thought, I'm gonna give my fish a break and put them out in this pond this summer. And the very next day they were all gone because the raccoon got them. So that certainly does happen as well. As far as the frogs go, yeah, the frogs always seem to find their way into all of our ponds. That's one thing I think we can say, that they do enjoy having all those extra spaces to create homes in. So, and I'm not sure, Kitty or Michelle, if you've talked to Chris about any other observations with that as well. But.
Yeah, we've been thinking, because we've noticed a lack of fish this year as well. We've been thinking it's probably a natural predator, just like you said. We have herons that visit the Arboretum. We have raccoons for sure. We have mink, and they will all make a meal out of fish. But there are still lots of frogs in that pond. So it still means it's a nice, healthy habitat. Frogs have very sensitive skin. They'll actually absorb oxygen through their skin. So any toxins in the water can affect them very quickly. But because there's lots of healthy, happy frogs there, we're thinking it's probably somebody came and made a meal out of the fish, would be the most likely guess we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's for all of you who know what our Japanese garden pond looks like. It's beautiful, but it's hard to imagine a great blue heron in that pond. It's a small pond, and it's really impressive to see such a large bird in that pond. But it's easy fishing, I suppose you could say so. Mm-hmm.
Another question coming in from Zoom is someone had a tree, a peony, which sadly some pond experts had to move and then replant about 3 weeks ago. Now all the leaves are brown. Do you think it's dead, or is there anything they can do to help it?
Yeah, that's tough to say. I think the leaves turning brown is a natural response of just being stressed. It had its roots obviously impacted during this time of year, and it's not able to pull up enough moisture to keep those leaves kind of fresh looking and green. That all being said, I wouldn't want to suggest that it's dead. It would really depend on how they moved it. And, if they were able to keep some of the root ball fairly intact, so the soil kind of holding on to the roots, then it means that there is a core of roots that are still pretty good. If it came out really loose and all the soil fell off, then it is a bit of a stressful event. But that all being said, again, this is the time of year where the plant still has a few months to recover its roots. So even though the plant looks like it's doing nothing up top and it's getting ready to go to sleep for the winter, it's really active underground. So my suggestion would be, if it's already been moved, to leave it, because if you move it again, you'll just add that stress one more time. The other concern would be in the winter, if it doesn't have its roots established as well as you'd like, it's more prone to drying out, so desiccating. And if you do find the buds or the twigs desiccate, then they will die over the winter, and they won't leaf out in the spring. So one thing you could do is to give it a little protection over the winter. And one little suggestion is you could, I'm not sure how tall your your plant is, but assuming it's just a couple feet tall, you could put some stakes or bamboo stakes around the plant. And then this winter wrap some burlap around it. And you can leave the top open, but even just wrapping that burlap around the plant means those harsh winter winds, when they come in, they don't hit the twigs directly, and it's they won't dry out as quickly. So it's just a little bit of protection till it gets its feet set again. And then next year, hopefully it's right back to where it was.
Yep. Do I cut it back at all? Maybe I'm thinking if there's some root damage, maybe it can't support such a large part above the ground.
I wouldn't do that yet. If it's already lost its leaves in those areas, then the damage has kind of already been done there. And if the twigs are still in good shape, then those twigs ultimately, if they can leaf out next year, then they'll actually produce leaves, which will help the roots grow quicker next year. So you'd be moving that. So I would say right now, mostly leave it in place.
Okay.
And if any of those tips do die off over the winter, then you can do that pruning in spring instead.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
And it looks like those were all the questions put into the chat. No questions came in through Facebook. So if that means that no one has any more questions, I think we may leave it off here. I'll give you guys a few more seconds if you have that last question you want to ask. Definitely, I do want to thank Sharon and Kitty for joining us today. I want to thank all of you guys for coming and asking such really interesting questions. And the recording of this event will be put up on YouTube, and it's on Facebook as well. So it looks like no more questions, so I think we'll leave it off out there. I hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.